This is the Global News Podcast from the BBC World Service. I'm Valerie Sanderson, and at 13 hours GMT on Tuesday the 6th of August, these are our main stories. Beijing warns protesters in Hong Kong about continuing their demonstrations. What's happening in Indian-administered Kashmir, a day after it was stripped of its special status? Why thousands of people have had to leave a town in Siberia. Also in this podcast, the artificial tongue helping to tackle the counterfeit whiskey trade.
It kind of works like the tongue in your head does, where you don't necessarily know what the chemicals are within coffee or whiskey, but you can identify them. It's just an advanced version of that.
China has come out with one of its strongest warnings yet to pro-democracy demonstrators in Hong Kong who've taken to the streets to protest against Chinese plans for the semi-autonomous territory, which returned to Chinese rule in 1997. China insists it will not be allowed to descend into chaos. A spokesman for the Office of Hong Kong and Macau says protesters should not underestimate the immense strength of the central government.
We want to warn the handful of violent criminals and the meddling hands behind them that those who play with fire will perish by it. The punishment will only be a matter of time.
Protests have taken place almost continuously over the past 3 months. Our correspondent in Hong Kong is Stephen McDonnell.
That was a strong warning from the central government in that press conference we had today. You know, a week ago we hadn't ever had a press conference from that ministry in the Chinese government that deals with Hong Kong affairs. Last week they had the first press conference, and the tone was very much along the lines of trying to calm things down and reassure people that the government was all in control and that things can be turned round. Today, very different tone. It was a much stronger set of threats, really, from the central government that those radical protesters, those who are prepared to throw bricks into the houses of police and the like, that the central government won't stand by and allow this chaos to threaten the stability of the entire country, and that they shouldn't underestimate the power that can be brought from the central government in order to bring things back to normal here. Now, he was asked specifically, does that mean People's Liberation Army garrison is going to be called out to some sort of martial law to return order here? He said that at the moment the police could handle it, he thought. And was asked again, so you're sort of ruling out the People's Liberation Army? No, they're not ruling it out. He's saying, don't think that we won't do what will be required to bring things back under control in Hong Kong if that's what's needed. But to give you an idea of the challenge, I mean, if the police says the police are under control, they know what they're doing. Up until yesterday, the police had fired 1,000 rounds of tear gas since the 9th of June. Yesterday alone, the police say they fired 800 rounds of tear gas. Now that gives you an idea of the escalation of what's going on. We were in the middle of these street battles in one area where a lot of tear gas, rubber bullets, pepper spray and the like was fired. That was happening in 12 different locations in Hong Kong at the same time. The people trying to set fire to buildings. There were again scenes involving underworld figures coming out very late to attack activists. So at times, very chaotic scenes here in Hong Kong. Really no indication of how it can be brought to an end.
Stephen McDonnell. Despite the furore over India's decision to remove the special status of Jammu and Kashmir state, there's no suggestion of it rowing back on the decision. The measure, which would see the territory divided and its special status revoked, was announced in the Upper House of Parliament on Monday. Now there's a vote on that division of the territory in the lower house of the Indian Parliament. Meanwhile, in Pakistan, politicians are also meeting in a joint session of Parliament to discuss their response. Mushahid Hussain Syed is one of the MPs.
The entire region, especially the people of Kashmir and the people of Pakistan, have been shocked by what the Indian regime under Prime Minister Modi has done, which has renounced the UN resolutions, which has annexed Jammu and Kashmir, and which has partitioned Kashmir on religious lines, because Ladakh is Buddhist majority and Jammu and Kashmir is Muslim majority.
Ahead of the announcement, tens of thousands of extra Indian troops were deployed in the territory. Our correspondent in Delhi, Yogita Lamai, told me what's happening on the ground in Kashmir now.
Phone and internet lines are still cut, so it's quite difficult to reach anyone who's in Kashmir. As you said, tens of thousands of extra soldiers have been deployed there because the government might have been anticipating unrest after this decision which was announced yesterday. What we also know is that top political leaders in the region were placed under house arrest. There are also rules which don't allow more than 4 people to gather in any place at any time, so which effectively means that public meetings or rallies or protests are not allowed at the moment. And so even though, I know from having been in Kashmir that, in many parts there will be anger about this decision, there will be opposition to it. The reason why we're not seeing that on the streets is because of, it's virtually in lockdown at the moment.
Now, where you are in India, the lower house is voting today. What are they discussing?
Well, so there were 2 things that were announced yesterday. One thing was revoking Kashmir's special status. That was just announced in Parliament. It was done by a direct presidential order. MPs didn't vote on it, and people are questioning the legality of that. The second thing that was announced, but which is actually a bill, so it is being voted on in both houses of Parliament, that relates to actually splitting the territory of the state of Jammu and Kashmir, as it's referred to here in India, into 2 separate parts. And that is a bill that was debated on and voted on yesterday in the upper house of Parliament, where it passed, and today it is being debated on in the lower house of Parliament. But I have to add, while of course there is strong opposition to this move from people in the region, from politicians there, from Pakistan, as we've seen, there are also many supporters of the move. Yesterday, in fact, supporters of the ruling BJP, we saw, them celebrating in many parts of the country, but also, ordinary citizens, because some people do believe that when India is a union of all states, then why should any one state have had, more autonomy than any others?
Our correspondent, Yogita Lamai. Thousands of residents are being evacuated from Achinsk, a town in Siberia, after a massive explosion at a military depot which reportedly contained tens of thousands of artillery shells. At least 8 people were injured, including service personnel. I got more details from Vitaly Shevchenko from BBC Monitoring.
We've seen truly apocalyptic scenes of a huge fire and billowing smoke and explosions. One clip doing the rounds on social media showed a proper mushroom cloud rising up to the skies. And also social media users today have been sharing videos of destruction caused by the exploding ammunition in nearby villages. And there's also dashcam footage of a missile exploding right next to a motorway. But for now, explosions appear to have stopped, and the Defence Ministry says they've put out the fire completely, and now they're using huge air tankers and helicopters to drop water onto the site to cool it down.
And tell us about this depot, this military depot near the town of Achinsk.
It's in Siberia, 3,000 kilometres east of Moscow, or 5 time zones east of Moscow. It's a pretty remote place, but the nearby town called Achinsk, there are 100,000 inhabitants, and they were believed to be under threat. Of them, 16,000 have been evacuated. Now, the state of emergency will stay in place until this evening, officials say, and then they'll re-evaluate the situation and think about bringing them back.
Do we know how the fire started?
The local officials, they say they've opened an inquiry and they're not quite sure yet. But one official, the Russian Deputy Defense Minister, he said they suspect what they call the human factor.
And there's also wildfires now in the area too, is that right?
In those parts of Siberia, not necessarily in Achinsk, but now is not a very good time to be in Siberia. They've got the wildfires, they've got the floods, and now also those explosions.
Vitaly Shevchenko. Still to come in this podcast, our reporter challenges the women who fled their homes to become Islamic State brides.
Why do you speak about what we deserve?
You knew what ISIS stood for. ISIS slaughter civilians. ISIS slaughter aid workers that have come to help Muslims.
Why are we getting blamed for things we have done? We haven't committed any beheadings or nothing like that.
And a new study shows that prenatal stress in both father and mother can affect an unborn child. An investigation into allegations of child sexual abuse at Chelsea Football Club during the late 1960s and 70s has concluded that a former chief scout was a prolific and dangerous predator. Eddie Heath, who died of a heart attack in the 1980s, has been accused of sexually assaulting several youth players at Chelsea. A separate review has found overwhelming evidence that young black players were racially abused by a former coach at the club in the 80s and 90s. Our sports editor Dan Rowan has more details.
Chelsea say the publication of these two reports is intended to shine a bright light in the dark corners of the club's history. An external review found a former chief scout was able to operate unchallenged as a prolific, manipulative and sophisticated sexual abuser of young footballers in the 1970s. It concluded that some adults at the club must have been aware of the crimes of Eddie Heath, who died in 1983, but turned a blind eye to what they saw. The report is heavily critical of former assistant manager Dario Gradi, who's accused of failing to tell more senior club staff about an allegation regarding the sexual conduct of Heath brought to him by the parent of a young player. An opportunity to prevent Mr. Heath from going on to abuse others was lost, the review found. Gradi told the review that he reported the allegation to an assistant manager and denied trying to smooth over the matter in a meeting with the boy's father. The report, which contains harrowing details of how Heath groomed young boys and used his influence at the club to make them keep silent, received evidence of sexual abuse from 23 witnesses aged between 10 and 17 at the time. Meanwhile, a separate review into allegations of racial abuse from the 80s and 90s, conducted by charity Bernardo's, concluded that black players were subjected to a daily tirade of racial abuse. It says a number of players recall hearing former Chelsea coach Gwyn Williams making racially abusive remarks. He told the review he denies any wrongdoing. Chelsea have now set up support and compensation schemes for the estimated 40 victims across both scandals and apologised unreservedly for their terrible past experiences.
Dan Rowan. Move over, whisky tasters. Scientists say they've developed an artificial tongue that can taste the difference between, say, a single malt and counterfeit alcohol. Annabel Meikle is director of the Keepers of the Quaich, the world's most exclusive Scotch whisky society. Gillian Marshall brought her together with one of the men who's developed the artificial tongue, Dr. Alistair Clark from the University of Glasgow's School of Engineering.
We've made a nanoscale tongue that's comprised of millions of tiny little metal taste buds. Gold and aluminium taste buds are about 1,000 times smaller than the width of a human hair. Now, when you shrink metal down to these tiny little sizes, it starts to take on really strange optical properties. And we can measure those optical properties. So in this case, they look a particular colour, and when you put whiskey on top of them, or in fact when you put any chemical mixture on top of them, that colour shifts ever so slightly. We monitor those shifts and we build up a statistical profile of the liquid, which is somewhat analogous to the sensation of taste.
Annabel Meikle, the beginning of the end for those such as you.
Dr. Clark and I have been doing the rounds this morning and we've agreed to not put our boxing gloves on this one. Now, what we would welcome in the Scotch whisky industry, anything that would help to maintain the wonderful quality and reputation that Scotch whisky has for being the finest spirit in the world. And counterfeit is a real problem with our whisky being sold into other countries. And we really want to eliminate that because we want our consumers all over the world to know that they are consuming the real McCoy, the best quality spirit in the world. So something that can help with this is great.
But Dr. Clark, how do you, or how does your artificial tongue distinguish between real and fake whiskey? You've described how it works.
So it kind of works like the tongue in your head does, where it you don't necessarily know what the chemicals are within coffee or whiskey, but you can identify them. And if you have the same coffee twice, perhaps you can identify that coffee again. It's just an advanced version of that. It's a tongue with a very good memory. So you show it the whiskey of interest, It learns what that tastes like, in inverted commas. And then when it is introduced to that whiskey again, it will say, yes, that is that whiskey. Whereas if it was introduced to something that was trying to pass off as that whiskey, it would be able to say, well, no, that's not the right thing.
And Annabel Meikle, you can do that, can you, confidently with your own tongue?
Yes, I can, and I compare it to any other muscle in your body. If you use it a lot and you practice, you become well tuned to it. So, in my role in the past, I was analysing whiskies in a lab every morning, and you can certainly spot when there's something different, something's gone wrong. So, yes.
And not just distinguish, Annabel Meikle, between real and counterfeit whiskey, but good and bad whiskey as well.
Absolutely, and your nose is really the weapon in all of this. Your nose can detect thousands of aromas, whereas your tongue is relatively blunt in terms of it being an instrument, picking up sweet, sour, salty, bitter. But when you put the two of them together, that's when you can really begin to identify the sort of myriad of complexity within your glass and pick out good whiskey and not such good whiskey.
Dr. Clark, you've got a tongue, but you haven't got a nose.
Yes, that's right. And certainly we might not be quite as sophisticated as people like Annabel, but there aren't that many of people as talented as her. So this would be a good way to have a backup system when there maybe wasn't an expert on hand to give you some sort of reading that you could trust.
So where are you expecting, Dr. Clark, your artificial tongue to be deployed?
I think that the chances are, detecting counterfeits is, although quite a sexy topic, it's possibly not the most practical one for this tongue. Perhaps, monitoring quality control on production lines of soft drinks is perhaps, where this might find a good use. Or monitoring environmental changes in rivers, for instance, is something I'm also interested in doing with this.
And Annabel Meikle, there are more counterfeit whiskies than ever around, are there?
Well, I'm not an expert on this, but yes, it is a problem, and anything that threatens the reputation that we have for Scotch whisky is a problem. A lot of testing whisky is really quite dull, and if most consumers knew how many tests their whisky had gone through before they were pouring it into their glass, I think they'd be very surprised. So I think it would be a welcome instrument for the industry.
Gillian Marshall speaking there to Annabel Meikle and Dr. Alistair Clark. Now, as any parent knows, it can be stressful awaiting the arrival of a baby. Now, new research has found that the emotional turmoil that some expectant parents experience, often resulting in argument and conflict, can have an impact on their unborn children. Professor Claire Hughes from the University of Cambridge's Centre for Family Research spoke to Update's Gillian Marshall.
Whereas people have looked at well-being in dads, and we know that matters, they haven't typically looked at mums and dads in tandem. So they've either just looked at dads or they've looked at mums and dads at different time points. So what we were able to do with our design was to enter them both at the same time to show whether there were unique effects of both mum and dad at any one point in time.
So the baby is about to arrive. The parents are getting a lot more tense. They're bickering, perhaps. They're arguing. And you are saying that kind of behaviour has an impact on the unborn child or the child when it is born and in its early years?
Yes, I mean, obviously we need to do more work to work out what the actual mechanisms are, but it does seem to suggest that well-being, even before the baby is born, is predicting child outcomes. So obviously some of that may be directly transmitted through the mother's kind of cortisol levels, but some of it may also be shaped by how they are interacting with their babies once the child comes along. So we know that prenatal thoughts about the baby predict sensitivity, so that may be part of that. So even if a mum is not anxious or depressed herself, living with a partner who's showing problems of anxiety or depression may deplete her resources.
So what sort of symptoms did you find in the children of parents who had been identified as being stressful in the lead up to the birth?
So remember that these children are 2, and terrible twos is a thing. So it's completely normal for children at that age to be showing quite high levels of temper tantrums or oppositionality or tearfulness, clingy behaviours. So we looked at the full range, so both the kind of acting out problems and the being sad, unhappy, tearful, inhibited, those sorts of difficulties. And that was the second thing that surprised me with the findings, was that I might have expected when couples are arguing that you might have a child who was more oppositional, but actually what we were getting was that it was more, the parents arguing was more related to the child being sad and tearful and anxious. And I think in hindsight that makes sense to me now that I remember that these children are only 2, so it's early days for them to be copying their parents. They're just directly affected by it, and it's making them a little stressed and unhappy. I don't want to pathologise this too much. This is a low-risk sample, so we're talking about normal levels of difficult child behaviours.
Professor Claire Hughes. The Kurdish authorities are pleading with Western governments for support in dealing with Islamic State foreign fighters and their wives and children. After fighting IS for 5 years, the Kurds are now having to manage prisons and camps full of radical IS supporters, including thousands of women who fled the countries of their birth to become IS brides, and their children, around 8,000 of them. BBC's Stacey Dooley has been to camps in northeastern Syria.
Hi, is it okay if I come through? Thank you.
Conditions in Al Hol camp are harsh and the atmosphere tense. Most of the women here still support IS, and IS wields enormous power over their lives. Many told me that they were too scared to be seen talking to me, but 2 British girls did. They were wearing the full niqab and wouldn't tell me their names.
They've been through hell at the hands of coalition.
So what do you want to happen? What do you think you deserve going forward?
They should. Why do you speak about what we deserve?
You knew what ISIS stood for. ISIS slaughter civilians. ISIS slaughter aid workers that have come to help Muslim kids.
Why are we getting blamed for things we have done? We haven't committed any beheadings or nothing like that.
Do you support ISIS?
I support Islam.
Do you support ISIS? Just please answer the question.
We support Islam.
What does that mean?
Hello. Where are you from? Germany. Where are you from? Canada. Are you? You might be able to help me. I need to speak to some women.
In another camp, Al Roj, I met Kimberly, a Canadian who went to Syria in the summer of 2015 to marry. At the time, so-called Islamic State controlled large parts of Syria and Iraq.
Why did you leave Canada to come and live in Syria?
I had married a year prior to that, and he came here. He was injured.
Where was your husband from?
Somalia.
Somalia. So presumably you met online?
Yeah, we met through friends of ours online, yeah. We were talking for hours and hours a day because I was at home.
So he was an ISIS supporter, an ISIS sympathiser?
Recruiter.
Completely. So what you're saying, he groomed you online.
Yeah.
How would he try and convince you, actually, you need to come to Syria?
He spoke about how it was illegal for me to stay in Canada as a tax-paying citizen because those taxes were funding jets that were bombing and were doing the very harm. And when my Facebook was flooded with images of Syrian children being bombed, that was horrific. And I got scared that I was actually becoming this terrible Muslim by turning my back. If he'd showed signs of being completely bloodthirsty and radical, I would have run. That's not how they do this.
When you left Canada to come to Syria, what were you thinking?
I was thinking with my heart a lot more than with my head, because I came to be with a husband who said that I could help work with children.
Do you accept accountability by sitting alongside them? I essentially am condoning all of their behaviour.
I regret because of what it did to my family and to my life, and because it has women like
civilians. There are aid workers, British aid workers, that came here to help Muslim kids that had their heads cut off.
But my opinion wasn't asked.
Kimberly is hoping she will one day be allowed to return to Canada where her children are, but at the moment, her fate is unclear. In Europe, only a handful of children who have lost both parents have been allowed back. Countries seem more open to accepting them if they don't come with the mothers who might be a problem.
That report by Stacey Dooley. And that's it from us for now, but there'll be an updated version of the Global News podcast later. If you want to comment on this podcast or the topics covered in it, you can send us an email. The address is globalpodcast@bbc.co.uk. I'm Valerie Sanderson. Until next time, bye-bye.
Music Life.
Music Life.
Music Life.
Music Life.
It's about how you love music.
Is anyone listening to what I'm making?
Wow, that's so cool.
Oh, that sounds sick.
It's a really beautiful song.
You can't see me, but I'm really excited.
Speaking to musicians from across the globe.
We're in private jets and 5-star hotels and all the rock star trimmings.
You're both on the same album of mine, but you've never met.
That's so cool.
About how they make their music.
Yo, this is a banger, man.
I know I need to just give some extra energy.
Finding out all about their creative processes.
When you change things, you surprise people.
Oh, okay. People like this. We're not annoying anybody.
And getting to the bottom of why they do what they do.
When someone comes up to you and tells you how your song helped them through a time, for me, that's the most satisfying thing.
Music Life, a brand new podcast from the BBC World Service. Hear the teaser now by searching for Music Life wherever you found this podcast.